The sound of crunching gravel at full throttle snapped me out of my quiet morning. My coffee sloshed in the cup as I turned my head, just in time to see the front end of Karen's bright red ATV fly into the air. She'd hit the new wooden wall I built across the trail, square on, launched herself over the handlebars, and landed flat on her back in a puff of dirt and shame. Her plastic sun visor went flying in one direction, her phone in another, and from the ground she started shrieking like a banshee in broad daylight. "You tried to kill me," she yelled, arms flailing, while her little yappy dog barked from the passenger crate mounted on the back of the overturned vehicle. I didn't say a word. I just took a slow sip of my coffee and pointed to the big sign on the wall that read "Private Property, No Access." It was the third time she'd trespassed this week, and she had the audacity to act like I was the criminal. This wasn't just about a shortcut anymore. This was war. Karen had been using the path that ran behind my property as her personal ATV freeway ever since I moved in 6 months ago. At first I thought maybe it was a one-time thing. Then it became a daily routine. The engine would start up at dawn, and I'd hear her rip through the back acreage like she was training for some kind of suburban motocross competition. One day I walked out to confront her, but she just waved like we were neighbors in a sitcom and kept right on driving. The worst part was she never once asked permission. She just assumed the land was hers to use. When I finally stopped her and mentioned it was private property, she laughed and said, "Oh please, everyone uses that path, it's basically public access." But I checked the deed. There were no easements, no shared right-of-way. That trail was 100% mine. Still she kept coming. I tried everything short of confrontation. I put up no trespassing signs. She said the wind must have blown them down. I put up reflectors. She called them an eyesore and threatened to report me to the HOA. That's when I learned she was not just any neighbor, she was the self-declared head of HOA enforcement. It wasn't a real position. No one voted for her. But she had a badge she made herself and wielded it like she was some kind of suburban sheriff. She started sending passive-aggressive notices for things like visible tools near my barn or my mailbox being half an inch too short. It was all intimidation tactics because I wouldn't let her use the shortcut. So I decided it was time to make a statement. I spent the weekend building a solid wooden wall across the trail complete with concrete anchors and cedar beams. It wasn't just for show. I wanted something sturdy enough to stop a determined Karen. I installed 2 game cameras, one high and one low, so there would be no dispute if she came through again. And just to make it clear, I added a painted wooden sign that read "End of the Road for Shortcut Queens." It was snarky, sure, but after months of her nonsense I felt it was more than justified. The morning she crashed into it was the first moment of peace I'd had in weeks. But of course it didn't last. She limped over to my porch and started banging on the door with one high-heeled gardening clog, screaming about lawsuits and medical emergencies. "You can't build a death trap in the middle of a trail," she shrieked. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." I calmly reminded her the trail was mine and she was trespassing. That only made her angrier. She threatened to call the police. I told her to go right ahead. Then I showed her the camera footage of her crossing into my land and the video of her ignoring the signs days earlier. Her face turned the same color as her ATV. She muttered something about HOA bylaws and stormed off back to her yard, dragging her busted ATV behind her with her dog nipping at her heels. I figured maybe that would be the end of it. A normal person might feel a little shame. Maybe even apologize. But not Karen. That night I noticed motion lights flashing in the direction of the wall. I walked out and saw her in her backyard with binoculars pointed directly at it. She had a notepad in one hand and her phone in the other. She was documenting it like she was building a legal case. The next day I received a letter slipped under my door. An official-looking HOA notice claiming I had created an unauthorized barrier that violated community standard. It was signed Enforcement Liaison Karen. No last name. Just Karen. I drove straight to the county office the following morning and confirmed once again that my land was not under HOA jurisdiction. In fact, it had been formally exempt for years because it used to be an agricultural lot before the neighborhood expanded. The clerk even gave me a copy of the original waiver with a stamp. I smiled the whole way home. Karen had no legal leg to stand on, but she was about to trip over her own nonsense anyway. That evening she returned with backup, 2 of her friends from the HOA board. All 3 marched up to the wall and started taking pictures like it was a crime scene. One of them even brought a measuring tape. I leaned on my porch post watching them as they huddled together, whispering like kids planning mischief behind the school gym. Then they left in a huff. I thought maybe they'd finally accepted defeat. But I was wrong. So very wrong. Later that night I reviewed the game camera footage just to make sure everything was recorded. And that's when I saw something that made me pause. One of Karen's friends had glanced up at the camera, then quietly reached into her bag and pulled out a can of spray paint. She didn't use it then, but she had it ready. I knew in that moment they weren't done. They were planning something. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. And I had just built the battleground. 2 days after Karen's infamous ATV crash, the neighborhood began to buzz with whispers. People walking their dogs slowed down near my property. Some nodded with what felt like approval. Others looked away awkwardly, clearly torn between HOA loyalty and pure entertainment. But Karen wasn't sulking in silence. No, she was rallying. Flyers started showing up on everyone's mailboxes with bold red letters reading "Emergency HOA Meeting." The topic was deliberately vague, something about community safety and obstructive structures, but I already knew what it was about. She was coming for the wall. She was coming for me. I wasn't technically on the HOA's list anymore, but my property was still close enough to be considered adjacent, and that gave me the right to attend the meeting as a concerned neighbor. I showed up 5 minutes early and sat in the back of the clubhouse with a bottle of water and a GoPro hidden in my shirt pocket. The room was filled with a small crowd of people in folding chairs, sipping lemonade and pretending this wasn't just a poorly veiled witch hunt. Karen stood at the front, arms crossed, tapping her notes with theatrical annoyance. She wore a pearl necklace and a pastel cardigan like she was running for office, but her eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside her. As soon as the meeting started, Karen launched into what she called a presentation but was really just a rant. She pulled out a large printed photo of her overturned ATV next to my wall and held it up like it was evidence from a war crime. This dangerous and unapproved barrier has been placed directly across a historic community access route. She used words like historic and community like they had legal weight, but anyone who'd lived here longer than a decade knew the trail behind my barn was just a leftover tractor path from the 80s. She twisted the story like a pro, though, implying that dozens of neighbors used the path daily for peaceful recreation. I looked around the room. Not a single person nodded in agreement. Most avoided eye contact. Then came the threats. Karen waved a stack of fake violation slips like they were court subpoenas. She announced that I had been fined $12,000 for multiple HOA violations: visual obstruction, landscape nonconformity, safety hazards, unauthorized structures. It was a storm of nonsense stacked so high I was almost impressed. But I didn't flinch. When she finally opened the floor for discussion, I stood up slowly and thanked her for the entertaining slideshow. Then I calmly informed the room that my land was not under HOA jurisdiction. I pulled out the stamped exemption papers I got from the county and handed copies to everyone in the front row. Karen tried to interrupt, but I held up a hand and kept speaking. I told them about the cameras, the signs, the harassment, and most importantly, the lack of any legal right for Karen to be using or claiming the trail as public. The room shifted. People sat straighter. A few nodded. One woman near the front even whispered finally. Karen's face went pale. Her mouth opened but no words came out. It was clear she hadn't expected resistance this well prepared. But then she pivoted. She said I might be exempt from the HOA technically, but I was still part of the community and should respect the norms. That's when I dropped the final bomb. I told them I had legal representation, and if any more false notices showed up at my property, my attorney would be involving county officials for harassment and abuse of power. Karen looked like she swallowed a lemon whole. The room stayed silent. I walked out before she could recover. The next day, just as I thought the dust might settle, I found my wall tagged with bright pink spray paint. The words "land thief" stretched across the boards like a toddler's tantrum in cursive. I reviewed the camera footage immediately. There she was, Karen's teenage daughter, wearing a hoodie and giggling with another girl while holding a can. They ran off into the woods after tagging it, laughing like they'd just pulled off the prank of the century. I could have gone to the police right then. But I had a better idea. I called my cousin Alan, who happened to be a civil rights attorney with a specialty in property law. He lived a few counties over and had been itching for a reason to come visit the farm. When I explained the situation and sent him the footage, he laughed for 5 straight minutes. He said this was exactly the kind of petty HOA tyranny he loved to dismantle. He showed up the next day with a stack of letters, a calm smile, and a digital folder ready to drop on anyone who dared push the boundary again. We walked together to the next HOA meeting. Karen was already mid-speech, scolding a neighbor about wind chimes. Alan waited until there was a lull, then stepped forward and introduced himself. He handed her an envelope with a cease and desist notice and informed her that if she or any member of the HOA contacted me again or stepped onto my property without consent, legal action would follow immediately. Karen tried to bluster, but he shut it down fast. He read aloud the exact section of the state code that made her fake fines invalid and made it crystal clear that I was under no obligation to entertain her invented authority. The silence in the room was brutal. Karen looked like a statue with a bad Wi-Fi signal. Then Alan handed a copy of the footage of her daughter vandalizing the wall to the board's secretary and said if we wanted to press charges, we could. Karen's tone changed overnight. She stopped barking at neighbors. Her ATV disappeared from the trail. But she wasn't done. That weekend, I caught a strange glare coming from my field at 2 a.m. I checked the drone cam and there she was again, this time creeping along the side of the wall with a flashlight. She didn't touch anything, just stared. Maybe hoping the wall would vanish in the dark. Maybe waiting for a moment to reclaim her imaginary shortcut. But the camera caught it all. The war was far from over. She was brewing something bigger. And now it wasn't just about her ATV. It was about power. And she was about to find out how powerless she really was. It started with a strange humming sound at midnight. At first, I thought it might just be the wind pushing against the wooden beams of the wall. But as I stepped out onto my porch with a flashlight, the noise got louder, mechanical, deliberate. I aimed the light across the field and saw shadows moving near the trail. Figures in dark clothes hunched low, creeping around the base of my wall. I immediately grabbed my phone and activated the drone cam feed. The live footage lit up with infrared tracking, and there they were, 5 people, one with bolt cutters, another with what looked like a crowbar, and 2 more standing guard while Karen herself pointed toward the beams like she was conducting a covert military op. She had returned, not with a legal case, not with logic, but with a mini demolition crew at 1 a.m. I hit record and let the drone quietly hover over the scene, its quiet rotors masked by the rustling trees. They started working on the far end of the wall, targeting the section that wasn't reinforced with concrete. The woman with the crowbar jammed it under one of the posts and began prying while Karen gave orders in a whisper shout. They weren't just removing the wall, they were trying to erase it. I couldn't believe it. After cease and desist letters, legal warnings, and police threats, she had resorted to straight-up sabotage. But I was ready. Before she made her move that night, I had already tipped off a local deputy about the possibility of property vandalism. I'd shown him the footage of the wall being tagged, the flyers, the HOA notices, and Karen's rants. The deputy, a man named Cruz, had laughed and said it was one of the weirdest HOA disputes he'd seen, but he promised to swing by occasionally. I sent him the drone footage live as the attack unfolded. He texted back one word: on my way. Down by the wall, Karen's crew was making progress. They managed to tear down one of the crossbeams and started stacking it to the side, as if hiding the evidence would change the fact that they were caught red-handed. I kept watching, barely breathing, until red and blue lights suddenly splashed across the trees like a disco gone wrong. Karen's head whipped around so fast it looked like it might spin off. The sound of a car door slamming was followed by a commanding voice echoing through a loudspeaker. "Step away from the structure, and keep your hands where I can see them." Panic broke loose. One of Karen's friends bolted into the woods, abandoning a bag of tools. Another froze like a deer in headlights. Karen, to her credit, didn't run. She stood still, hands clenched at her sides, jaw tight like she was trying to convince herself this wasn't happening. Deputy Cruz approached with his flashlight scanning the scene. When he recognized Karen, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "You again?" he said with an amused tone that only made her more furious. She launched into a rambling defense about property access, historical pathways, and emergency ATV route. Cruz cut her off by pointing at the drone hovering above. "The footage's already uploaded," he said. "You've been caught dismantling private property on camera. That's criminal trespass and vandalism." Karen tried to shift the blame. She said the wall was dangerous, and someone had to remove it for safety. Cruz looked her square in the eye and asked if she was a licensed inspector. When she didn't answer, he asked the next obvious question. "Did you have the landowner's permission to be here tonight?" She didn't respond. I could see it all from my porch, every second of her unraveling. She was charged on the spot and driven off in the cruiser, while her friends stood awkwardly by waiting for rides home. The sound of her dog barking from her porch across the street added a strange, poetic soundtrack to the moment. The next morning, the neighborhood was on fire with gossip. Photos of Karen being led to the squad car spread like wildfire in the local Facebook group. One post read "HOA Queen dethroned" with a crown emoji and a screenshot from the drone footage. Another neighbor dropped a link to the news story that aired later that day. Apparently, a reporter had picked it up from the police scanner and ran a short segment on suburban property disputes gone wrong. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in our area knew exactly who it was. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the same evening, this time without Karen leading the charge. I didn't attend, but word got back that 2 board members called for her removal. One even admitted she had pressured them into helping plan the wall takedown. Alan filed the civil suit the same day. He wasn't subtle about it either. The documents included drone stills, timestamps, police reports, and even Karen's previous violation slip. She was being sued for property damage, trespassing, emotional distress, and harassment. Alan also reported the HOA to the county commissioner's office, citing abuse of influence and misuse of authority. Within 48 hours, I received confirmation that an investigation into HOA operations had begun. Karen had gone from fake authority figure to criminal defendant in less than a week. She made bail quickly, but she didn't return to her usual patrols or community surveillance. Her house went dark for days. No lights, no ATV engines, no yappy dog barking at mail carriers. The silence was louder than her old rants. I took the opportunity to rebuild the wall, this time with even sturdier materials and a new layer of decorative stone on the side facing the street. I added a new sign too. It read in plain bold letters, "This is not a shortcut." And just below it in smaller print, "Property boundaries matter." For the next few days, I watched neighbors walk by, stare at the sign, then smile or chuckle. One guy gave me a thumbs up and said, "You're a local legend now." I wasn't aiming for that. I just wanted peace and boundaries. But Karen had tried to bulldoze both. Now she was the one with fences closing in on her, not just literal ones, but legal ones. The wall she crashed into the first time was only the beginning. Now the real one, the one built with legal filings, footage, and public shame, was higher than she'd ever be able to climb. The courthouse hallway was quiet except for the rhythmic click of Karen's heels on the polished tile. She walked in ahead of her attorney, a young man who looked like he had just passed the bar and regretted ever answering her call. Karen was dressed like she was attending a Sunday brunch instead of a court hearing: light pink jacket, matching bag, and a pearl necklace that swung every time she turned her head to scowl. I sat at the far end of the row of benches, next to Alan, who looked completely at ease with a stack of files on his lap and a tablet in hand playing back the drone footage for the 5th time. We didn't say anything when Karen walked by. She made a point to avoid eye contact but muttered something under her breath loud enough for no one to hear clearly. Alan smiled and leaned over to whisper, "The higher they puff themselves up, the better they fall." Inside the courtroom, things moved faster than Karen probably expected. She'd filed a response that downplayed the charges and framed herself as a concerned citizen taking action to protect her neighborhood. Her attorney leaned heavily on words like civic duty, community care, and public risk. But when the judge asked if she had permission to be on my land or remove part of a private wall, the response was nothing more than a long pause followed by a weak no. But Alan stood and laid out everything in sequence like a movie plot. He showed footage from the drone of Karen and her friends at night, tools in hand, actively pulling apart my wall. Then he played the game camera footage from earlier in the month when she and her daughter spray-painted insults across it. Then he provided the stamped exemption papers showing that my land was legally not under HOA jurisdiction. He added a cherry on top by producing copies of the cease and desist letters and the official report Deputy Cruz had filed after the midnight incident. The judge didn't ask many questions. She listened, and her expression told me everything. Karen, who had probably expected this to be a slap on the wrist or a settlement she could cry her way out of, started to realize she was running out of runway. Then things got worse. One of the witnesses Alan called was one of Karen's own HOA board members. A quiet man named Harold who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He sat nervously before the court, and when asked if Karen had encouraged the wall teardown, he sighed and said yes. Not only that, but she had allegedly told him that if he didn't help, she'd dig up minor violations on his property and fine him until he gave in. Karen's attorney objected, but the judge let it stand. That moment shifted everything. It wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was coercion, manipulation, and clear abuse of power. Karen looked like she wanted to disappear. Her lawyer fumbled through rebuttals that had no weight. Alan didn't even need to say much after that. He simply rested the case with the evidence neatly submitted and a final statement that emphasized not just the personal violation but the community impact of someone in self-appointed power behaving like a dictator. The judge excused everyone for 15 minutes before returning with her decision. Karen was found liable on all counts. She was fined $25,000 in damages, issued a formal restraining order requiring her to remain at least 300 feet from my property, and the court referred the HOA's activities to a state oversight committee for further review. Her attorney looked crushed. Karen just stood frozen like she couldn't process what had happened. After the ruling, people outside the courtroom began whispering and pointing. The story had reached more ears than just those in our neighborhood. A local reporter who had been covering small-town disputes was there with a notebook, and though he didn't get an interview with Karen, he did get a perfect shot of her storming out with that same pearl necklace now swinging with rage instead of confidence. It was poetic. I shook Alan's hand as we walked to the parking lot. He grinned and said, "I hope she tries to appeal. I could use a second round." But the fallout didn't stop at the courtroom steps. That very evening, Karen tried to get her ATV out of impound, and that's when the final piece fell into place. The police informed her that it was being held as part of an ongoing property crime investigation, and until the case was fully closed and reviewed by the state attorney's office, it wasn't going anywhere. She argued, of course. She claimed it was her main method of transport for wellness, and said she had back issues and needed the ATV to navigate the neighborhood. When asked for medical documents, she had none. When asked why she used it to trespass, she had no answer. They turned her away. She stood in the parking lot screaming at a teenage receptionist who simply went back inside and locked the door. The HOA, meanwhile, was melting down. 2 more board members resigned after hearing about Harold's testimony and the state oversight. The president of the board issued a public statement on social media saying that while the HOA had historically operated independently, it was now undergoing a full review and suspending all enforcement activity until further notice. It was basically an admission of guilt. People who once sided with Karen quietly deleted their supportive comment. One even knocked on my door the next day to apologize for believing her stories about me. She said Karen told everyone I was a conspiracy nut who bought land just to sabotage the HOA. I smiled and told her I preferred chickens to conspiracies. Karen didn't return to public life after the ruling. Her house remained quiet. No more HOA flyers, no more speeding ATV engines, no more neighborhood patrols. For a few days it almost felt too quiet. But I took the silence as a gift. I added more flowers along the rebuilt wall and began designing a small mural for the side that faced the trail. It would feature a cartoonish ATV flying over a wooden fence with the words "Keep Out" written underneath it in a friendly but firm tone. It wasn't about gloating. It was about making it absolutely clear that boundaries, real, legal, and moral, had been re-established. And as for Karen, the real sentence wasn't the fine or the restraining order. It was watching her influence evaporate. Every bit of power she thought she had was gone. No one feared her clipboard or her threats. No one attended her meetings. And no one believed her stories anymore. She had spent years crafting a kingdom on thin air, and now it had vanished in one season of truth, resistance, and a very well-placed wall. The breeze rolled over my property like it was exhaling relief. The scent of fresh cedar still hung in the air from the new enhancements I'd added to the wall, which now stood prouder than ever. 4 weeks after the court ruling, there was no sign of Karen. Her house looked frozen in time. No footsteps on the porch, no HOA flyers stuck in mailbox flags, no buzz of her infamous ATV engine echoing down the trail. The neighborhood felt like it had woken up from a long, ridiculous fever dream. I hadn't realized how much noise she had brought into everyone's lives until it was gone. The silence felt like peace had finally returned. But peace wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something else. With Karen dethroned and her influence shattered, the HOA board held an open meeting to discuss internal reform. This time, they invited homeowners instead of just fellow rule enforcers. The mood was different, cautious but hopeful. People who had once rolled their eyes at HOA meetings now showed up with real questions. I didn't plan to speak, but when they asked for volunteers to help write new guidelines, a few neighbors turned to me, smiling. One of them nudged me and said, "You fought her harder than anyone. You should help make sure this doesn't happen again." I agreed. Not because I wanted power, but because I had seen what happened when the wrong person got it. I proposed a complete audit of HOA authority, with clear boundaries on enforcement powers, stricter checks on who could serve, and a complaint process that didn't just end with one person making judgment calls from their porch. It took some time, and not everyone liked the changes, but slowly things began to shift. The HOA board voted to eliminate Karen's invented title entirely. No more enforcement liaison. No more fake badges. No more weaponized newsletters. They even changed the format of violations, requiring third-party review for all disputes, with documentation required before any fine could be issued. For the first time, the HOA became something that served the people instead of the other way around. Meanwhile, Karen's home went up for sale. A modest listing appeared online with carefully angled photos to hide the fact that her front flower beds were half dead and the garage still had scratches from her ATV rack. The description was neutral: quiet street, strong community ties, scenic trail nearby, but locals weren't fooled. She didn't get a single offer for 3 weeks. Then the listing changed. A red banner appeared across the top saying price reduced for quick move. I overheard someone joke that even her house was trying to escape her. Eventually a buyer from out of town snatched it up, probably not knowing the full drama behind the fence lines. Karen moved out quietly one Sunday morning, loading up a rental truck with her daughter and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Nobody came to help. Not one neighbor waved goodbye. The day after she left, I went out to inspect the far side of the trail, just to make sure there were no surprises waiting for me. That's when I noticed something odd. A slab of decorative concrete built into the earth on her old side of the line, barely visible under overgrown weeds. I cleared it and found something ridiculous. A patio and a small shed Karen had built 2 years earlier. I checked my old property maps again, just to be sure. The line was clear. Her shed and patio were sitting on my land. By law, anything left behind on private property without claim for a specific period became the property of the landowner. I let out a laugh right there in the field. Even when she left, Karen had gifted me one last parting twist. Instead of tearing it down, I turned the shed into a chicken coop and painted the side with a custom sign that read Karen's Retreat. I even added a small weather vane on top in the shape of an ATV. It became an inside joke around the neighborhood. One man brought his grandkids over just to take a photo in front of it. Another neighbor offered to buy shirts with the logo. I never expected the wall saga to become a form of local folklore, but here we were. And honestly, I didn't mind. If it reminded people where unchecked arrogance leads, then it was worth keeping. As summer came, the trail behind my property started to come alive again, but not in the same way. There were no more rogue ATVs cutting through the grass or neighbors being harassed for their wind chimes. Instead, I saw kids biking safely along the new path I'd opened up on my side, marked clearly with permission signs and boundaries. I even hosted a small barbecue for the neighborhood, something Karen had probably never allowed without 3 permits and a noise warning. People brought food, stories, and a lot of laughs about the whole ordeal. It felt good. Simple. Like things were finally as they should have been from the start. The wall stood firm, not just as a physical barrier, but as a symbol of standing your ground when someone tries to bulldoze over your rights. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was principle, measured out in concrete, camera footage, and courtroom minutes. It marked the line where someone's entitlement finally met someone's limit. Place where enough truly meant enough. Looking back, I realized this story was never just about a shortcut through a field. It was about how small people with a taste for control can grow into something dangerous when no one stops them. Karen had built herself a little empire on fear, rules, and fake authority. But like any empire built on sand, the moment someone pushed back, it collapsed. I didn't win because I yelled louder or played dirtier. I won because I documented, prepared, stood calmly, and refused to let absurdity rewrite the truth. And that's the part people respected. When people pass my place now and glance at the wall, I often hear them mutter something like "good for him," or "finally someone stood up." And to me, that's worth more than any courtroom victory or viral video. That wall changed things. Not just for me, but for everyone who watched a Karen finally meet her match and lose.